In the long corridors of religious history, there are stories whispered so quietly that even the walls seem afraid to echo them. Stories that challenge the very foundations of faith, devotion, obedience, and the human soul. Among these, one tale rises like a dark shadow over the sacred halls of tradition. A scandal so unbelievable, so disturbing, that its echoes reached the very heart of the Vatican. For 5 long years, behind the closed doors of a remote convent hidden far from public sight, 12 nuns lived under a silence deeper than prayer and a fear stronger than faith. These were women sworn to purity, obedience, and spiritual service, yet trapped in a secret darker than sin itself. A single slave, held in captivity, became the center of their torment and their tragedy. And when the silence finally broke, when truth forced its way through the barriers of power, every one of the 12 nuns was found pregnant. The world reeled, the church trembled, and the Vatican was left facing a nightmare that defied doctrine, morality, and human decency. This is not just a story of scandal, it is a story of power abused, innocence destroyed, and a system forced to confront its own shadows. Today, we open the door to that hidden chapter, uncovering how such a secret survived for years, who allowed it, and why the truth refused to remain buried. The hidden power structures inside the convent formed a complex web of silence, hierarchy, and unquestioned obedience, creating the perfect environment for 5 years of concealed wrongdoing. Within these walls, authority did not simply guide the daily routine. It shaped every breath, every thought, and every decision. The Mother Superior held the highest earthly power in the convent, and her word carried the weight of divine instruction. Below her were senior sisters who had spent decades inside the cloister, their loyalty unquestioned, their devotion unwavering, and their influence immense. At the bottom were the younger nuns, many still new to religious life, still exploring their identities as women of faith, and still learning to surrender themselves fully to the structure that governed their days. This layered system was not inherently corrupt, but in this isolated convent, far removed from oversight, it was precisely the structure that enabled a darkness to grow in silence. Authority in such an institution is often designed to protect virtue, discipline, and tradition, yet it can also become a shield behind which cruelty hides. The Mother Superior controlled every aspect of life, from daily duties to confessions, from the flow of supplies to the schedule of visitors. No external auditors, no clergy from outside, no Vatican representatives visited for years. The convent's isolation was justified as dedication to spiritual purity and retreat from worldly distraction, but in reality, it allowed unchecked power to take root. Over time, fear and obedience became so deeply intertwined that the sisters learned not to question, not to challenge, not even to whisper doubts among themselves, because such doubts were taught to be spiritual weakness. In this environment, commands were followed automatically, without reasoning, without debate, without the freedom to resist. The slave, who was kept inside the convent, became both a symbol and a victim of this diseased structure. His presence was not merely hidden. It was institutionalized through the silent approval of those who held authority. Those at the top justified their decisions, under the guise of protecting the reputation of the convent, maintaining order, or preserving their interpretation of spiritual discipline. The younger nuns, expected to be obedient above all else, were told their role was simply to comply. Many of them had taken vows of submission, which in theory meant surrendering their will to God, but in practice meant surrendering their will to those who claimed to speak for God within the convent's walls. The internal culture reinforced the belief that questioning authority was a form of rebellion against the divine. The Mother Superior used scripture selectively to reinforce obedience, quoting passages about humility, servitude, and the dangers of pride, while ignoring teachings about justice, compassion, and the sanctity of human dignity. Over time, the sisters learned that silence was the safest response, that compliance was a shield against punishment, and that stepping out of line could lead to isolation, penance, or spiritual condemnation. The fear of being labeled disobedient became more powerful than their personal moral concerns, and so the structure held firm even as the situation grew darker. Behind closed doors, the convent's routines were strictly choreographed. Every task was assigned, every movement observed, every conversation monitored. Surveillance was subtle yet constant, embedded not in cameras or guards, but in the eyes of senior sisters, who believed they were upholding the sacred order. These women had long since accepted the idea that loyalty to the institution outweighed loyalty to the truth. Over time, they became enforcers of silence, not out of cruelty, but out of a deeply ingrained belief that anything threatening the reputation of their convent was, by definition, a threat to God's work. In this mindset, protecting the institution became their highest form of devotion. Power imbalances inside religious institutions can be magnified when individuals are cut off from the outside world. And this convent was a striking example. Letters were censored, visitors were screened, and communication with families was minimal. Many of the younger nuns came from backgrounds where the convent was seen as a refuge, a sanctuary, a place to escape hardship. For them, speaking out was not only terrifying but unimaginable. Their sense of identity had become inseparably linked with their place in the hierarchy. To challenge the Mother Superior was to challenge the very purpose that had given their lives meaning. This internal dependency made it nearly impossible for them to recognize the full extent of the abuse, let alone attempt to resist it. The system was further reinforced by the emotional manipulation that often thrives in environments where authority is blinded by its own sanctity. The Mother Superior would frame obedience as loyalty, submission as virtue, and silence as sacrifice. She would remind the sisters of their vows, of their duty to the Church, and of the spiritual consequences of disobedience. Guilt became a tool of control, shaping the minds and hearts of the sisters until they no longer trusted their own instincts. If any nun felt discomfort, fear, or moral conflict, she was made to believe that these emotions were signs of spiritual weakness, rather than warnings of wrongdoing. This created an inner conflict that kept them psychologically confined, even when their physical confinement was not absolute. Through these pressures, the power structure became self-sustaining. Even those who questioned, even those who cried in the night, even those who prayed for strength to speak out, found themselves unable to break through the layers of authority and tradition. They feared not only the reaction of the Mother Superior, but also the reaction of their fellow nuns, who might see their descent as betrayal. In such an environment, solidarity was replaced with suspicion and unity became impossible. The very community that should have offered support became a network of eyes, ears, and silent judgments. The environment was also shaped by the belief that suffering was a form of purification. Throughout history, certain religious traditions have emphasized endurance as a pathway to holiness. And in this convent, that belief was twisted to justify silence in the face of suffering. The sisters were taught that enduring hardship without complaint was a sign of spiritual strength, and this teaching was weaponized to silence them even further. If they endured emotionally, they were praised. If they questioned what they were enduring, they were warned. This mindset blurred the boundaries between spiritual discipline and psychological coercion. In this layered and oppressive hierarchy, the abuse was not a sudden eruption, but a slow, suffocating progression that flourished through silence, fear, and the manipulation of religious duty. The power structures inside the convent did not merely allow the scandal to happen. They cultivated the conditions that made it seem unchallengeable. The psychological and spiritual conflict faced by the 12 nuns began long before the scandal was discovered, rooted in the fragile intersection between faith and fear, devotion and coercion, purity and human vulnerability. Each of these women had entered the convent with a belief that they were stepping into a life of peace, prayer, and purpose. Many came from troubled families or broken communities, looking for sanctuary, meaning, or escape. Others arrived with fierce spiritual conviction, dreaming of dedicating themselves completely to God, but in the quiet halls of the convent, far from the world they once knew, their identities began to shift as they were shaped by the expectations placed upon them. Slowly, the line between their personal beliefs and the institution's control grew blurred. In their yearning to be obedient servants of God, they became obedient servants of those who held earthly power, and it was this emotional vulnerability that made the internal conflict so devastating. Everything they had been taught encouraged them to suppress their own thoughts, to treat their doubts as flaws, and to question themselves long before questioning those in authority. This created an inner tension that deepened with every passing day. When they were first confronted with the presence of the enslaved man in the convent, many of them felt a sharp pang of confusion and fear. This violated everything they knew about morality, scripture, and their vows. Yet they were told that this situation existed for reasons beyond their understanding, and that their duty was not to analyze, but to accept. The Mother Superior framed the situation as a burden they must carry in silence, for the sake of the convent's spiritual mission. This placed the sisters in a psychological bind between the instinct to reject what felt deeply wrong and the religious duty to obey without hesitation. Over time, their moral instincts became tangled in layers of guilt. Each nun felt that her discomfort was a sign of spiritual weakness. They questioned whether their feelings were temptations from the devil, tests of faith, or symptoms of their inability to fully surrender to God. This inner turmoil made them doubt themselves constantly, weakening their sense of individual judgment. They prayed for clarity, yet the clarity they sought never came. Instead, their prayers were accompanied by shame, fear, and confusion. Each sister struggled with a private battle between the values she once held as sacred and the new reality she was forced to accept. This internal war gnawed at their spirits, leaving them fragmented and emotionally exhausted. As time went on, the situation deepened in complexity and psychological weight. The presence of the enslaved man became a constant reminder of their loss of control, a symbol of their captivity in a system they could not escape. The forced encounters they experienced left each nun battling a storm of emotions she had no words for. They lived in a state of profound contradiction. Their bodies were violated, yet they were expected to remain holy. Their minds were tormented, yet they were told to maintain serenity. Their faith was shaken, yet they were instructed to pray harder. This conflict built a wall of silence around them, isolating them not only from the outside world, but from each other. Even though they shared the same pain, fear kept them from confiding in one another. No one knew who might be loyal to the Mother Superior or who might report them for expressing doubt. The psychological strain became a constant presence, haunting their dreams and creeping into their prayers. They felt trapped in a labyrinth where every path led deeper into confusion. Their spiritual foundations began to erode little by little. Some of the nuns interpreted their suffering as a divine test, believing that God would reward their endurance. Others began to lose trust in their own understanding of Scripture, wondering whether they had misinterpreted their faith entirely. This spiritual distortion made them even more dependent on the authorities who manipulated them. Whenever a nun tried to resist internally, her conscience battled her conditioning, leaving her caught between the voice of her own moral truth and the voice of institutional obedience that had been drilled into her since the day she took her vows. The emotional trauma intensified as their pregnancies began to develop. For many of them, the moment they realized they were carrying a child was the moment their inner world shattered. Their vows of chastity had been central to their identity as nuns, and now their bodies bore visible proof of a violation they were not allowed to speak about. Each day, they were forced to navigate the contradiction of nurturing new life while feeling spiritually broken. The physical changes in their bodies made it impossible to escape the reality of what they had endured. Their reflections in the mirror became painful reminders of the conflict raging within them. They feared God's judgment, the church's judgment, and their own inability to reconcile what had happened with the vows they once held sacred. Some of the nuns tried to find solace in prayer, but prayer became a battlefield rather than a refuge. When they knelt before the altar, they felt exposed, unworthy, contaminated. They begged for forgiveness even though they were not the ones who had sinned. They sought peace, but peace felt distant, as if hidden behind layers of shame and silence. The guilt they felt was not rational, yet it was powerful enough to crush their sense of self. They were trapped in a mental prison where every thought spiraled back to the same painful questions. Why had God allowed this to happen? Why hadn't they been strong enough to resist? Why had their vows not protected them? The questions had no answers, yet they lingered constantly, tearing at the threads of their faith. Their spiritual conflict was intensified by the fear of outside discovery. They knew that if the truth were revealed, the world would judge them harshly. They worried not only about their own reputations, but about the reputation of the church they had dedicated their lives to. This loyalty became another layer of their suffering. They wanted to protect their faith, yet they feared that their very existence had become a scandal to it. This emotional pressure made them feel simultaneously responsible and powerless, burdened by a weight that no one should carry. Their identities as women of God and their experiences as victims collided inside them, creating a crisis that reshaped their entire understanding of faith. They sought meaning in scriptures, looking for passages that could help them make sense of their suffering. Some found temporary comfort in the stories of biblical figures who endured hardship, but the comfort was fleeting. Others felt distance from the Bible entirely, as if the words no longer spoke to them the way they once had. Their relationship with God became strained, not because they lost belief, but because they no longer knew how to approach the divine from a place of innocence or trust. Amid this turmoil, the bond between the nuns weakened even further. They felt ashamed to look at one another, afraid that their shared experiences would be reflected back at them. The silence that bound them to secrecy also separated them emotionally, leaving each woman alone with her nightmares and her guilt. Some tried to hide their struggles behind routines and smiles, while others became withdrawn, their eyes shadowed with unspoken pain. They lived together, prayed together, worked together, yet each carried a private sorrow that felt impossible to share. In this war between faith and trauma, between obedience and morality, between silence and truth, their spiritual foundations cracked under pressure they were never meant to endure. The explosive discovery that shocked the Vatican did not begin with a dramatic revelation, but with a series of small, unsettling signs that finally drew the outside world's attention to the convent. For years, the sisters had lived behind a wall of silence so thick that even rumors struggled to escape. Yet secrecy, no matter how deeply buried, eventually gives way to truth. The unraveling began when a young visiting priest noticed inconsistencies. During a routine pastoral visit, he observed subtle tensions among the nuns, a nervousness that flickered in their eyes, the way they avoided certain hallways, the way their conversations abruptly shifted when he entered the room. At first, he dismissed it as shyness or the pressure of maintaining strict discipline, but something lingered in his mind long after he left the convent. He felt the presence of something hidden, something unspoken, and despite trying to silence his own concerns, the memory returned to him again and again. The real breakthrough came when one of the nuns fell ill and was transferred to a nearby hospital. The doctors, unaware of the convent's internal order, performed routine examinations. What they discovered shocked them. The woman was not only malnourished, but pregnant, and her psychological state was fragile. Her quiet sobs, her trembling hands, her refusal to answer certain questions raised alarms. The hospital staff, bound by medical ethics and legal responsibility, reported the situation to church officials. This was the first crack in the wall of silence. When representatives from the church arrived to inquire, they expected an isolated incident. What they found instead was a trail of signs leading to something far more serious. Their questions were met with evasive answers. The Mother Superior's explanations were vague, and the atmosphere in the convent was thick with fear. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that one nun's pregnancy was not an isolated case. Several of the sisters showed similar signs of malnutrition, trauma, and physical strain. Whispers began to circulate among the investigators that something unimaginable was being hidden within the convent's walls. These whispers turned into urgent conversations behind closed doors. When the investigators insisted on speaking to the nuns individually, without the presence of senior authorities, the truth began to bleed out in fragments. Some of the nuns broke down in tears, unable to maintain the full weight of calm. Others stared silently ahead, their fear so palpable that it chilled the room. None of them openly spoke the full truth, but their expressions, their trembling voices, and their quiet pleas for help told a story that no words could fully conceal. The turning point arrived when one of the youngest nuns, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, finally confessed the existence of the enslaved man hidden within the convent. She whispered his name, described his condition, and revealed the forced encounters that the Mother Superior and senior sisters orchestrated. And silenced, she did not have the strength to recount every detail, but she said enough to make the investigators' blood run cold. Church authorities were forced to confront a reality that violated every law, every moral code, and every sacred vow ever upheld by the institution. The shock spread through the clerical ranks like wildfire. The Vatican, accustomed to handling scandals discreetly, was suddenly faced with a case that was impossible to ignore. The moment the Vatican officials confirmed the presence of a hidden captive was the moment the scandal exploded. They arrived in silence, accompanied by legal authorities and specialized church investigators, determined to uncover the full truth. The Mother Superior tried desperately to block their access, invoking tradition, privacy, and spiritual authority, but her resistance only fueled suspicion. When the investigators pushed past her and entered the sealed-off section of the convent, they were met with a sight that shattered any lingering doubt. The enslaved man was found weak, traumatized, and physically deteriorated. The room where he was kept bore the marks of confinement, locked doors, chained restraints, and a bed that spoke of years of suffering. His eyes, hollow with fear, told the story that the nuns had been too terrified to speak. The discovery of his existence shook the Vatican to its core. The very idea that such an atrocity had taken place under the watch of a religious institution was unthinkable. What horrified them even more was the systematic nature of the abuse. The way authority within the convent had been twisted into a weapon of control. When the medical examinations of the remaining nuns confirmed multiple pregnancies, the Vatican found itself in the center of an explosive, unprecedented catastrophe. Every detail uncovered deepened the nightmare. Church officials knew immediately that this was not a case that could be contained quietly. The moral stakes were too high, the damage too great, and the shame too heavy to conceal. The news spread rapidly through the highest ranks of the Vatican. Cardinals whispered in hallways, bishops exchanged grim glances, and even the Pope was briefed urgently. The language used in these briefings was cautious, but the gravity was unmistakable. This was not merely a scandal. It was a spiritual crisis. Some officials reacted with fury, others with disbelief, and some with sorrow so deep it felt like a wound. There were debates about how such abuse could have gone undetected for years, how such secrecy could have persisted, and what failures and oversight had allowed this to happen. The Vatican was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that its systems of accountability were not just flawed, but catastrophically inadequate in protecting the vulnerable. As legal authorities began their involvement, the story took on a global dimension. The Church's urgent attempts to control the narrative collided with the pressure of external investigations. Journalists began hearing rumors of something unusual occurring in the region. They noticed increased activity around the convent, officials moving in and out, and whispers among local residents who had long suspected that the convent was hiding something. Once the story reached the media, even in fragmented form, it spread rapidly. The global press seized on every detail, and soon headlines across the world carried variations of the same shocking narrative. The Vatican faced international scrutiny, public outrage, and demands for transparency. The Church, which had weathered scandals before, found itself unprepared for the magnitude of this one. The pregnancies of the 12 nuns became a symbol of the institution's failure to protect those under its care. Questions poured in from every corner of the world, and accusations followed. The Vatican's credibility was shaken, its moral authority questioned, and its internal systems exposed as dangerously vulnerable to corruption and abuse. Inside the convent, the atmosphere became even more tense. The nuns, once isolated and controlled, were now confronted with waves of interrogations, medical examinations, and psychological interviews. Many of them felt conflicted, ashamed, relieved, and terrified all at once. They were finally being heard, yet the weight of exposing the truth felt nearly unbearable. The enslaved man, now under the care of authorities, faced his own emotional and physical recovery, carrying scars that ran deeper than most could imagine. He became the central figure in the investigation, a living testament to the horror that had been hidden. As each new fact emerged, the Vatican realized the full scale of the crisis: a deeply rooted abuse of power, a network of silence, and an institutional failure that would leave an indelible mark on the Church's history. The scandal did not end with the discovery. In many ways, it began there, unraveling layers of hidden suffering, institutional negligence, and moral collapse that would alter the Church's future in ways no one had anticipated. How this scandal exposed deep-rooted systemic failures became clear only when investigators began examining not just what happened inside the convent, but how such horrors were allowed to continue for half a decade without detection. The incident was not the result of a single person's cruelty or one moment of poor judgment. It was the final consequence of long-standing structural weaknesses within the religious institution itself: failures in oversight, failures in accountability, failures in transparency, and failures in moral courage. As investigators pieced together timelines, testimonies, and internal documents, they discovered a pattern of neglect and institutional blindness that extended far beyond the convent's walls. It was a pattern shaped by centuries of traditions that prioritized reputation over truth, hierarchy over humanity, and silence over justice. Every layer of the Church's administrative structure had, in one way or another, contributed to the perfect breeding ground for abuse. One of the most glaring systemic failures was the absence of regular external oversight. The convent, located in a remote area and dedicated to contemplative life, had gone years without receiving any thorough inspection or pastoral evaluation. The Church's guidelines technically required periodic visits, but in practice, these visits were often superficial and symbolic. Local diocesan officials tended to assume that convents were places of purity and order, not potential sites of abuse. This assumption proved catastrophic. The Mother Superior had learned over time that no one would question her leadership deeply. No one would investigate beyond the surface. and no one would verify her accounts unless something extraordinary forced them to. This created an environment where she could wield her authority without fear of challenge, knowing that the institution's inertia would protect her from scrutiny. Another systemic failure lay in the culture of silence that permeated many religious institutions. The Church's long-standing emphasis on obedience, humility, and internal resolution of problems unintentionally discouraged individuals from speaking up. If a nun had tried to report what was happening, she would have had no clear channel to do so without first going through the very authorities who controlled her life. There were no confidential reporting mechanisms, no external advocates, and no guaranteed protection for whistleblowers. Speaking out meant risking punishment, isolation, spiritual condemnation, or removal from the convent. This created an environment where even the whisper of dissent felt dangerous. The nuns were trained from their earliest days to suppress doubt, to avoid conflict, and to maintain unity at all costs. This conditioning ensured that even those who were horrified by the events unfolding around them felt paralyzed by the fear of retribution. A deeper examination revealed another flaw. The Church's decentralized structure often allowed local authorities to operate with almost complete autonomy. While the Vatican maintained ultimate authority over doctrinal matters, the day-to-day oversight of convents fell to local bishops, many of whom were already overwhelmed with responsibilities. Some had hundreds of religious communities within their jurisdiction, and unless a problem was brought to them explicitly, they were unlikely to intervene. The Mother Superior exploited this decentralization. She knew that as long as she submitted basic reports, upheld the appearance of order, and avoided external controversy, the higher authorities would leave her convent in peace. This allowed her to construct a closed ecosystem where her decisions went unquestioned, her actions unchecked, and her abuses unchallenged. Another systemic issue that surfaced was the absence of mental health support. Within many religious communities, the nuns who joined the convent were often young, impressionable, and emotionally vulnerable. They had committed themselves to lives of sacrifice, discipline, and isolation, often without understanding the psychological challenges such a life could bring. The Church lacked proper psychological screening, training, and support systems for those entering religious life. As a result, many of the nuns had no tools to process trauma, resist manipulation, or evaluate unhealthy spiritual teachings. Their vulnerability made them susceptible to the Mother Superior's authoritarian influence and created a community where abnormal behaviors became normalized over time. Without mental health resources, the sisters had no outlet to express their fears, confusion, or emotional pain, allowing trauma to fester unaddressed. The scandal also exposed the damaging effects of placing absolute trust in leadership. The Church had long held the belief that those in positions of authority, superiors, abbesses, priests, were guided by divine inspiration. This belief, while rooted in tradition, had the unintended consequence of making it difficult to challenge or question those leaders, even when their actions seemed questionable. The Mother Superior used this cultural reverence for authority to justify her decisions and silence dissent. She portrayed obedience to her as obedience to God, twisting spiritual teachings into tools of control. This misuse of religious authority highlighted the need for clearer boundaries, accountability structures, and training programs to prevent power from becoming a weapon. As the Vatican reviewed documents and transcripts, another systemic flaw emerged: the institutional fear of scandal. For generations, the Church had prioritized preserving its public image, believing that the exposure of internal wrongdoing would harm the faith of the laity. This mindset had led to a culture where problems were often addressed quietly, internally, and without transparency. While the intention may have been to protect the faithful from scandal, the effect was the opposite. Silence became the shield behind which abuse could flourish. In this case, the fear of scandal likely contributed to earlier missed opportunities to catch warning signs. Local clergy may have dismissed small concerns because they did not want to attract negative attention. This culture of concealment created cracks through which immense suffering slipped unnoticed. The institutional reliance on tradition also played a significant role. Many convents still operated under centuries-old rules that had never been updated to align with modern standards of safety, human rights, or psychological well-being. The structures that governed the convent were relics of a time when unquestioned obedience was considered the highest virtue. In an era where institutions are expected to operate with transparency and accountability, the convent remained locked in outdated practices that made abuse easier to conceal. The scandal prompted the Vatican to confront these systemic flaws. With unprecedented seriousness, committees were formed, policies reevaluated, and leaders questioned. The Church realized that protecting the vulnerable required more than spiritual teachings. It required structural change, procedural reform, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The institution's shock was not simply about what happened, but about the realization that the system itself had created a perfect storm of conditions that allowed this tragedy to unfold. The Vatican had to acknowledge that the Church's structures were not merely flawed, but dangerously outdated, and that without change, similar abuses could occur again. This awakening forced the Church to reconsider how it trained leaders, how it supervised religious communities, how it investigated complaints, and how it protected those who lived under vows of obedience. The scandal illuminated weaknesses that had long been ignored, pushing the institution to reevaluate its moral responsibilities and its role as a guardian of the vulnerable. In facing the aftermath, the Church was forced to confront not just the horror of what had happened, but the systemic failures that had made it possible, setting the stage for deep introspection and potential transformation. In the end, the scandal did more than expose a hidden horror inside one isolated convent. It cracked open the doors of an institution that had long relied on silence to protect itself. The cries that went unheard for years finally echoed across the world, forcing the Church to confront its own shadows. The 12 nuns, once trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience, became living proof of what happens when power is left unchecked and faith is twisted into a weapon. Their suffering demanded answers, demanded change, demanded that the walls of secrecy finally fall. The enslaved man, rescued after years of unthinkable captivity, stood as the clearest reminder of the human cost of institutional blindness. His existence alone shattered the illusion that holiness guarantees purity of action. His survival forced leaders to acknowledge that evil can take root anywhere, even in the places considered most sacred. And as the Vatican struggled to rebuild its credibility and reform its structures, the world was left with a stark truth. No institution, no matter how ancient or revered, is above accountability. The scandal became a symbol of a new era, a warning that silence is its own kind of sin, and a reminder that the pursuit of truth must always rise above the fear of scandal. What happened inside those walls may never be erased, but it forever changed the way the world looks at power, faith, and the fragile line between devotion and darkness.